Hello, everybody. My name is Jesse O'Neill, and this is going to be your webinar for Pivot Tables Made Simple. I hope everybody's nice and comfortable and ready to learn a little bit more about pivot tables today. It's, of course, a live webinar happening right now, which means that you get to ask any and all of your questions throughout the presentation. Of course, I've got everybody on mute, so make sure just to type out your questions. I'm going to be monitoring the chat on the left-hand side of my screen here. So just, yeah, for sure, type out your questions. I'm going to be getting into the questions at the very, very end of the presentation. So once I'm done with the teaching all about the pivot tables, of course. So yeah, with that, have some fun today. Just to give you a little bit about myself, I am, of course, a trainer for CompUIs. I'm very excited to be a trainer for CompUIs. Because I work with an amazing team. We have great trainers that, of course, deliver training on site. We also do online for CompUIs, and of course, for our sister company, JME Software. I do a ton of pivot table, I guess, training along with my Excel level 3. So that's where I'm taking some of this information from. So if you are, of course, interested in a bit more information about pivot tables as well as some other really cool tips and tricks with Excel, feel free to join our Excel level 3 or any of our tips and tricks courses that we've developed ourselves as well. So just to get us started off, I did just want to explain a little bit about JN Software and CompUIs, because some people do get a little bit confused why we have the two different brands. So we do have JN Software, which represents kind of Canada-wide training. We do a lot of online training. We do a lot of one-on-one training, and we also do some other things like consulting and stuff like that with JN Software. CompUIs is very focused on the Ottawa area and the Quebec area as well, close to Ottawa. And we, of course, do a lot of on-site training for public classes, as well as some training for, some training for, I lost my train of thought there. Okay, so sorry, some one-on-one training, some public training, as well as some training for private classes. So if you want us to come to you, we can certainly do that as well. All about training. But of course, what we both offer is just very skilled people, people that really know what they're doing for classes. We'll never send you somebody that doesn't know the software, of course, and we have very the people that are working for us really do want to have everybody learn, which is why we do have a policy that if you don't learn something from our classes, then of course we have a comeback free policy there as well. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a tidbit about that and about what we are super excited to be offering for everybody here. Alrighty, so with that, I'm actually going to go straight into my pivot tables examples here. So I'm going to switch over to Microsoft Excel, which does have my sample data there for me. So what I'm going to do when I get started here is I'm just going to explain kind of what you should approach pivot tables for, like why you are using pivot tables. And then I'll give you some examples of when your data kind of looks good for pivot tables, when your data maybe needs a little bit of improvement to be able to use it into pivot tables. We'll continue on, and I can give you just the fundamentals of pivot tables going into it. And then, of course, we do have some other things like adding some pizzazz into the pivot tables as well. So adding things like your pivot charts, your slicers, things like that, that'll allow you to present your pivot tables really nicely to your management team and things like that. So with that, let's go into, first of all, what you are starting with, or what why you would use a pivot table. Okay? So pivot tables are going to be there for analyzing your data. Typically with a pivot table, you do have some numerical data because you're doing at least a basic statistical analysis of your numerical data. So you can see here on my good data example that we've got, I've got my store information. Each store has individual salespeople. Those salespeople have an identification, of course. You normally have that. And then you've also got your daily sales amount, so how much they actually sold. And of course, if they've made anything over, you can see up here on the right-hand side, if they've made anything over $2,500, then they get this $50 bonus as well for that day. So what we're going to be doing in here is we're going to kind of come into the pivot table with some questions that we want to pose. For example, we might want to know how many bonus dollars were paid out per store. We might want to know how many bonus dollars were paid out per individual. We also might want to know maybe even a time series. So when the $50 were paid out and how much per day was paid out per store or per individual and things like that. So with your pivot tables, you do have to have your data kind of organized in a proper way. And that way Excel can recognize your data and give your data kind of labels. The way that Excel does recognize our pivot tables is just by these labels that you have at the very top of your screen there. So you've got the store ID there, you've got your date, you've got the first name, last name, ID, daily sales, and bonus. So each and every one of these, what they're going to do is they're going to allow Excel to recognize the data that's below it. Each individual line or row that you see in this set of information that we've got here is considered to be one record. So Excel does recognize these all as a related set of data. It is considered to be one record of data. Of course, the records of data are shown below, which goes to actually mention, it's worth mentioning, I should say, that your pivot tables, or at least the data behind the pivot tables, does have to be what we call column-based data, which means that you do have your field name at the very top and then the information related to that field below it, as we're seeing here on that screen. So before we get started into the actual pivot table itself, which is probably the simplest part of the process, is actually creating the pivot tables. The other part of it is just making sure your data looks correct. So you can see that I have all of my data filled in. There are no holes in the data. It's column-based, as I mentioned before. So let me just give you some examples of maybe bad data, things that you wouldn't want to put in a pivot table. So we'll go over to the first tab over here, bad data example 1. This one's actually quite obvious, as you can see here. We've got exactly the same information. Nothing's different about the details that we have in this information that we're going to be using behind the pivot table. The only problem with this is that it is row-based and it is not column-based like we had in our good data example. So that's one of the things to avoid. Make sure that you have it in a column-based. In the second example here, you can see right off the top of the bat that some of these are not filled in. And of course, that is a fairly common example because you may have a table that you've got, a table of information that you've got, and not all of the information is complete in that table. You need to fill it in. Now, of course, this will still work with a pivot table. You will be able to use the pivot tables, but the problem that you'll be seeing is that it will treat these empty cells as kind of zero values. So your pivot table might not look the way you're expecting it to because you've actually got these in here and Excel will consider these as a $0 value in here. So you won't be completely lost. I mean, you can use it, but you will run into a couple of small issues with holes in your data. On the bad data example 3, you can kind of guess already just by taking a look that there are no headers to the data that you're seeing in here. And that is actually quite a big problem. And the reason being is because Excel doesn't know how to label your different fields. You'll see when I do start creating my pivot tables that I've got, Excel will definitely say, well, I don't know what to do with this, right? So you do have to have those headers in there. at the very least, put something like column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4 up at the top. But of course, the more descriptive you get, the easier it will be to determine what data you're looking at and that sort of thing. So it's actually for your benefit to put in some very descriptive headers at the very top. And my last piece of bad data, or the last bad data example that I'm going to give you today, is going to all be about our numerical data. As you can see here, I've kind of just cut out the numerical data to give an example. And that's actually not going to work because pivot tables are there to summarize information. And if it's going to summarize information, it needs to summarize it using a sum, using an average, using something similar to that. In the middle, you'll see it'll become very obvious when I start creating the pivot tables that you do need that kind of meat and potatoes of that pivot table. Now, that being said, it is possible to create a pivot table without the summary information in there, but it's not going to be easy, and you might run into quite a few problems. So just keep that in mind when you are creating your pivot tables. You are creating the pivot table to analyze some pieces of numerical data in there. Okay. So just a reminder to everybody, we do have the chat at the very top, so you should be able to use that if you do have questions throughout. Yeah, certainly type out your questions. I will be getting to them at the very end of the presentation, and I'll be able to answer any and all of your questions. Let's go back to our good data example because we're going to use this as the basis for our pivot tables. So what I'm going to do, just a quick little tip to select an entire set of information. Control A on your keyboard is going to do that for you. And these are the types of little tiny tips that you don't necessarily get on YouTube or anything like that. So be sure to show up in our classes so you can learn some of these little tips. I mean, that was a small one, but there's quite a few others that'll save you some time. All right, I've selected all of my data there. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to go to my Insert tab, and I'm going to go to either pivot table or recommended pivot tables. When you first start using your pivot tables, recommended pivot tables might make a lot of sense because Excel will actually give you some good, I guess, starting points for pivot tables. So let's just click on that one to get started. Alrighty, so now, as you can see here, there are some recommendations on the left-hand side. And if you can remember from the beginning of my presentation, I did mention things like, you know, I want to know the amount of bonus dollars that were paid out per individual or per store or things like that. So you can actually see this one's a very good starting point for a pivot table. As you can see in front of you right here, there's a little preview of that pivot table. Now, of course, if I were just to use that, that would just that wouldn't take me very long. It wouldn't be a very good presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to start with a blank pivot table so that I can show everybody how to create those from scratch. We're going to click on the blank pivot table here. And you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen when you first get started with a blank pivot table, the most important part, of course, is your pivot table fields. Each one of these fields are going to correspond with those headers that you had, the column headers you had in your data. So you have your store ID, you have your date, your first name, last name, ID, daily sales, and bonus. And of course, those all make sense if we go back to our good data example tab. Those all relate to the headers that you see up here. So as I was mentioning before. It is blank on the left-hand side. One of the tricks that people always get, I guess, a little bit tricked up with is when you click out of your pivot table or you click off of that box there, you can see that the pivot table information goes away. So that's contextual. When you do click back into your pivot table information will come back. So it is contextual to whatever you happen to be working on in Excel. So if you're not working on your pivot tables, it tries to kind of give you a bit more real estate so that you can work on other things instead. Alrighty, so just to get started with pivot tables is actually quite straightforward, really. You just have to start by dragging and dropping. All you have to do is you have to, again, come to your pivot table with some questions. So we wanted the bonus dollars per individual, right? So bonus dollars would be a good or a good field to start with. And I guess the per individual would be another good field to start with as well. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop my ID into either my columns or my rows, because the columns and the rows, they're going to represent your categories. So I'll drag and drop the ID from up here in my fields to my columns. And I'm going to drag my bonus dollars. Again, you do need that summary information. So the summary is going to be underneath your values section here. We're going to drag and drop the bonus dollars into that values section. As you can see, it's already starting to build that nice and easy pivot table up at the very top. Of course, that's not going to be the best way to display this information, because when you're looking at it, it's across. It's kind of ugly looking. It doesn't look the best, and it's a little hard to read as well. So one of the best, I guess, features that you have in pivot tables comes from the namesake itself. You get to actually pivot your data really quickly. So if I just move my ID field from my columns into my rows, you can see that already it's starting to look a little bit better. Now, you also might want some categories in here, right? You might want a little bit more high-level information as well, because you're going to be presenting to a range of different people this information. So for the high-level information, what I'm going to propose is maybe you want to have your store ID in there, just showing which store each one of these salespeople come from. So I'm going to drag and drop my store ID into my rows here. And you'll see that you get, of course, the store ID information, store 1, store 2, store 1, store 2, store 1, but that's not the most efficient way of looking at it, of course. The reason being is because it's repeated quite a few times over, and you don't really need that in there. So again, just by using these fields here, we can drag and drop, and we can make the store ID the top level category that we have just by dragging it above. You see the little green marker that you have there. Drag it so that it's above the ID field. And now you can see that it's a lot more efficient in terms of the data. You've got your store 1 and your store 2, and then categorized underneath that is the salesperson that belongs to each of those stores. And with this, you also have a couple of little buttons that you can use to collapse your pivot table. So I'm just going to click on the little minus button next to store 1 and the little minus button next to store 2, and you can roll up your data. So depending on the audience that you have, you can use this data to show different things, right? So I'll just expand those back. Now, with this information, you might want to display it in different ways. Sorry, my mistake. I clicked out of the pivot table there. So right now we do have, of course, the amount of bonus dollars that's giving us some good information, but there's a couple of things here. First of all, it's not formatted. And second of all, you might not want the actual dollars. Maybe you want to know the percentages just to see how well each individual is working. I guess how the better salespeople that you have there, it's really obvious when you've got percentages in here as well. So we can add in percentages. We can also change the formatting in here. All of that will be underneath your sum of bonus values. You just have to click on the little down arrow next to it, and you can see there's an option here for value field settings. That value field settings is going to allow you to manipulate the data. The first piece that you can have in here in terms of manipulation is you've got the name, of course. That one's the most simple. So we can change that in a second, but we're going to actually display this data as a percentage of a total value. Now, as you can see here, you do have a number of operators. Depending on what you want to do with that data, you've got a sum, a count, an average, and that sort of thing. In this case, we're just going to leave that sum, and we're going to show the values as we're not going to show it as no calculation. We're going to change that to percentage of the grand total. So what it's going to do then, it's going to sum everything, and you can see the sum at the bottom is 4,000. And it's going to show each of these values as a percentage of 4,000. Okay. And now, because we have it as a percentage of the grand total, we can change our name so that it's more descriptive and just say percentage of grand total. As just an example there. You can, of course, choose whatever title you'd like, and then I'll click on OK here. And now you can see that A, it did format it nicely in there, and B, you're getting a little bit more of a descriptive piece of information for each of your individuals. In here, we also have some filters. So if you're not, if you don't want to filter based on all of the data, maybe you want to filter based on the date or something like that. You only want to show a certain date range in this table here. You can add in filters just by dragging and dropping into the filter section here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag and drop the date into the filters. And you'll see that that added a little section at the very top. And that section will allow me to filter out just by clicking on the little down arrow there. And the down arrow has quite a few different dates. All of these dates, of course, are being pulled from that underlying data in the Good Data Example tab. So all of those dates that I saw in the filters exist somewhere in here in this date column. So going back to my sheet 1. Okay, so then we're going to click on the button that says Select Multiple Items. Select Multiple Items is going to allow you just to use your checkboxes to only see the dates that are applicable to you. So for example, here, if I wanted just to show the first 2 weeks of January rather than the whole month here, I'm just going to uncheck everything that doesn't belong, and I'll click on OK. And now, what you're seeing, and you might not have noticed, but it did kind of flicker there really quickly, and that's because the numbers are now being reflected just based on the dates that I had selected. Alrighty, so another couple of things that I want to mention about the pivot tables is how to add a little bit extra in there, how to add in a little bit of pizzazz into your pivot tables, because this is really just a straightforward set of data. It's very useful, and it allows you to present things really well. But of course, you want to see a little bit more in here. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear my filter that I was using. I can either just clear the filter using the Select All button up at the very top, or I can actually just, drag and drop this filter out entirely. So I can either hit Remove Field, or actually my personal preference, because it's kind of like throwing something out the window, I can just like drag and throw that out of the filter section there, and then your filter will be removed entirely. At the very top, when you are working with your pivot tables, you'll see that you do have the Analyze and Design tabs underneath Pivot Table Tools at the very top there. So if you do click outside of that pivot table, again, those tabs are contextual, so they will only show up when you are working with the pivot table. So just make sure you click on your pivot table, and then you can go into the Analyze section here. Myself, I'm kind of a meat and potatoes type guy. I like to show how things work, and then I like to show how to make them a little bit prettier. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and I'll show you how to make things work first, and then I'll show you how to make them prettier depending on what we need to do. Alrighty, so we already talked a little bit about our slicers, and this is the first piece of pizzazz that I'd like to show you here. We talked about the filters earlier. The slicers are going to be essentially the same thing. There's no real difference between your filters and your slicers, except for the fact that they look a lot nicer on the screen. They're a lot more intuitive to use. And if you're sending this pivot table to somebody else so that they can use it, use the data in there, then what you're going to end up with is just a really user-friendly version of a pivot table. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the Insert Slicer, In here, I'm going to be able to choose what I would like to slice on or what I would like to filter with. They're both the same thing. So what I can do here is I can actually choose the store ID. I can choose my individual ID, so the salesperson's ID. And I might want to filter based on my date as well. So I'll choose that date up at the very top. And click on OK here. As you can see, you'll get 3 little graphical elements that will pop up. You can reorder these or add them wherever you would like to add them. So I'm just going to put them next to my pivot table here. And these are essentially just really easy to use filters. Oops, I made a mistake there. Alrighty, perfect. So as you can see, they first start off being blue, which is quite nice. And then you can click on them, and that will quickly and easily filter out your data. So when I click on store 1, you can see that store 1 information shows up on the left. Click on store 2, and only the store 2 information shows up on the left. The other thing that you might notice here is that based on what I click on, the other slicers will automatically update so that they will be contextual to what your current set of data is. So what I mean by that is that when I click on store 1, you can see that only Jackie, Leah, and Stanley end up in store 1. So those are the ones that are available for filtering further out. When I click on store 1, maybe I'm just interested in Stanley. I can click on Stanley here, Leah, or Jackie. What you will notice if I clear the slicer here is that the individuals that are not part of the data set are grayed out. So yeah, you can use them, but it's not going to make any sense to use them because they're not even in your pivot table at the time. Now, if you want to clear your filters, of course, it's just the clear filter button at the very top. So I'm going to clear this filter. This seems to have been filtered right off the bat. There is a multi-select option, so either control on your keyboard or there is a little multi-select button here. So I would recommend using the multi-select button. So I'll just check off all 3 of those. And that just allows you to choose multiples of something. One of your filters or your slicers here. So that's pretty cool. Our next part here is going to be about charts because filtering is great, but it's not going to make a lot of sense if you don't have your charts in there as well, because the charts are a perfect way of visualizing the data that you've now summarized. So what I'm going to do with my charts is I'm going to just click on my pivot table here. Again, you're going to go into the Analyze tab. And the Analyze tab allows you to add on a pivot chart, which is underneath the Tools grouping on the right-hand side of your Analyze tab. So if you just click on that, Excel is going to ask you which type of chart you want. You can see there is pretty well a limitless list that you can choose from depending on what statistical analysis you're looking for. Myself, I am most interested in the clustered column, which was what was recommended to me by Excel. So I'm just going to use that one. But you can see there's a number of other kind of versions of it, whether you want to go 3D or if you have some additional pieces of data to add into the pivot chart. But we're going to go just simply with the column here, the clustered column. And I'll click on OK. That will add in my pivot chart. It is important to note that with your pivot charts, they are going to be very much based on the data that you have across, right? So as you can see here, I've got Jackie, Leah, and Stanley, Jerry, and Lucas. But as I start removing certain pieces of data, you can see they belong to store 1 and store 2. Let me just take out my store 2 information there. And you can see only store 1 is present. And now you can actually drill down into the data just simply by using those slicers at the very top. It's going to affect your pivot table on the left, which is your data. It's also going to affect your chart here. With the charts, there's some information that you should know. And I guess the charts, the slicers, and the pivot tables are going to work similarly in how you can style them. So when you click on them, you'll notice that the contextual tabs at the very top, those are going to update based on what you are currently editing. So I've got my chart here. When I click on my, you can see it says Pivot Chart Tools at the very top. When I click on my slicer, you can see it says Slicer Tools at the very top. And I click on my my pivot table, and you can see it says Pivot Table Tools at the very top. So we'll start off, because most people, when you are doing any sort of styling, again, some more pizzazz to add to this chart here. When you are doing some styling, you'll notice that the charts are where you kind of start off with your styles most of the time. Now, on the right-hand side, you do have a couple of contextual buttons. So if you are one of those people that likes to be quick about your styles, then you would use the contextual buttons on the right-hand side. But of course, if you go to your Design tab for your pivot chart tools, the plus, which is Insert Element, or Chart Elements in general, is up here on the left-hand side underneath Design, Chart Element. And that little paintbrush, Chart Styles, is the exact same as the chart styles that you see up here in the middle. So all of these little contextual buttons, this is just Excel giving you a couple of different ways of doing the exact same thing. Right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to click on the plus, and I don't really need the legend in there. It's not giving me a lot of information that I need, so I'm just going to remove the legend. With this as well, you might want some axis titles. You might want to change around your axis around there, so you can add some more information in there. The one that I particularly like is that data table at the very bottom, and that just gives me a bit more information, because the bars aren't descriptive enough when you're just looking at it, in my opinion. You can choose what you would like, and so I'm going to add the data table. There is a whole multitude of different things that you can do. You can see at the very top of the styles, there are a lot of different styles there for you as well that give you a bit more information. But there is a lot more that you can do with these elements as well. So if you just click on the arrow, it'll give you some other information to do with your grid lines. You can even go into more options, which just brings up a whole huge set of information. All right. If you're not happy with your colors, again, in design, you can click on just change colors here, and you're going to change those. So maybe you want it in orange. With other parts that you have in your pivot tables as well, you're going to need to style them to be similar to how you have your chart. So you're going to want to click on things like your slicers, go into your slicer options, and maybe choose a slicer color here that will better represent the rest of the data. And finally, with your pivot table tools that we have, again, go into your Design tab and choose one that makes a little bit more sense for your styles. I would like to mention that I do go into a lot more depth when we do this in my Excel level 3. So I do actually go through every one of the styles that you can do, and some really cool tips and tricks in terms of what elements you can add onto your charts and your pivot tables and stuff like that. So we go into a bit more depth in my Excel level 3. So if you want to attend that, that would certainly give you a bit more information about pivot tables, as well as, of course, a lot of other topics there too. Okay. Alrighty, so that pretty well goes over the pivot tables. I do have some questions that I'm seeing coming in, but I do want to give a bit of time for each individual to kind of formulate their questions. I know if you're just like me, I always remember my questions, 10 minutes after the presentation is done. So you can certainly talk to us. I'm going to give you a little slide that's going to give you some information about us and how to contact us and that sort of thing. But while I'm waiting for some additional questions, there's already a couple there. But while I'm waiting for additional questions, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you our website, give you some of our other tools that we have, because we don't just offer webinars. We do have a lot of other free information that you can pull from, some blogs and stuff like that. So let me just switch over to my web browser here. So the first thing that I wanted to show you while we're thinking about questions, please again, do type out your questions in there. That'll help me out quite a bit. so that I can help direct things here. But with our Excel level 3 that you're seeing here, you can see that we do have quite a few other topics other than pivot tables. Section 4 is the pivot tables, but we do go into some basic macros at the very top. We do go into analyzing and presenting data with what-if analysis. So this is kind of more of a statistical analysis piece in here. Consolidating our data as well. We can link cells, we can merge workbooks, we can also export our data. And down here, I actually like the themes and the templates because they make your life a lot easier in terms of, not always having to create your stylistics in Excel. You can create a kind of a jumping off point instead. So that's being offered in Ottawa here or online, but it's on Tuesday, the 18th. We do also, as I mentioned before, offer not just public classes, which your Excel one would have been the February 18th is a public class, but you can also order private and group training sessions. We also have one-on-one training sessions, so you can definitely check out our CompUE's website or the JN website depending on where you are to access any of those. We are not just the Excel level 1 and 2, level 1, 2, and 3 shop. Of course, that is what we do often, level 1, 2, and 3. But you can see that we also have quite a few other courses that we offer, including the Excel tips and tricks. The Excel tips and tricks was actually written by my amazing colleague, Christine, and she does go over that in a lot of detail. It saves me a lot of time. I've taken it a couple of times, and it's really, really quite excellent. Just to give you a lay of the land on our CompUE's website as well as our JM website, doesn't matter which, at the very top right, you will get your blog, your free webinar information, as well as our YouTube channel. So be sure to check all three of those things out. I just want to give you a few of our other webinars coming up in case you'd like to join. If you like this one, please do. You can see at the very top, we got our pivot tables. That's the one that's today we just had. And we also have our Excel tips and tricks, which I go through some of Christine's tips and tricks. Of course, not all of them. She does a full course on tips and tricks. And of course, you have Microsoft Word and a few other tips and tricks with Microsoft Word. We have OneDrive, and finally, we have an Office 365 webinar coming up. So please check out those webinars. Just read quite a bit because there's a lot of information about what's being presented in those webinars there. We do also have a blog which has some free information in there for you. So you can see that you have, your custom views just at the top, some of the ones that we've done recently. We have updating numbers without using Excel. We have the Adobe Creative Cloud application, so blog entries like that just to help you out. And finally, if you're not a fan of reading, you'd like to watch instead, we do have quite a few different videos that most of which are done by Christine as well, that were very good for helping you out as well. They're kind of tips and tricks there as well in our JME Software and CompUE's YouTube channel. Alrighty. So, just getting back to the questions, to answer a couple of questions. The first one's really good. I really like it, so I'm really happy that it was asked. First of all, the last one was all about attendance. So let me just send a message to the organizer just to see what we're doing with the attendance there. Just give me 2 seconds here. Okay, I should get a response back about that pretty quick. The first one is all about what is considered to be an empty cell with our good data. So if you go to your good data example, you are noticing that you do have a few here that has a little, I guess, a dash through that. All that is formatting. So if I do remove the formatting off of there, you can see on my home, there's a little section called number, and the number has a bunch of different formatting options here. So if you do change that to general rather than accounting, which it currently is, you can see that's a 0. So those dashes actually just represent a 0. So those aren't empty cells at all. The ones over here are empty for sure because there's nothing in them. So what we consider empty cells, just stuff that doesn't have any data in there at all. These might be a little bit confusing actually, just because I formatted it that way. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, the empty cells are just stuff without data in there. For the slicers, there is a question on there. It says how to remove a slicer if we don't want it. Okay, so we are here underneath on our pivot tables. You can see at the very top we do have the slicers, as I mentioned. But also, as I mentioned, your slicers aren't your only way of filtering. You can also use your filters on the left-hand side. So you might actually just want to stick with that. And if you've got slicers in there, you might want to remove them. So it's just a matter of clicking on it. You can see it's a graphical element, and then hitting delete on your keyboard will get rid of it. There's a few other ways of doing it, but probably your best way is just click on it, hit delete on your keyboard. That will get rid of that slicer there for you. I missed the beginning. Can you show how to set up a data comparison of year 2018 versus year 2019? Okay, yeah, actually pretty quickly I can do that for sure. One thing I'll mention though about these pivot tables, and it does really bring up a good point, is that your data that you are pulling out of your pivot table is only really as good as the data that you're putting into the pivot table. So if you do want to create a little comparison, you do have to have that data in there. And right now I've only got 2020 data. So what I'll do for you, just to give an example of how to compare 2018 to 2019 data, is I'll just add in another column here really quickly to add the 2019-2018 data. So I'll just change this date field. I'll change it to a year field. And then in here, I'm just going to mock up that some of these entries were from 2018 and some of them are for 2019. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Let's change the formatting here to general. There we go. 2019. So I am just mocking up this data quickly, and that's not the fill that I would like. So let me just copy my cells instead. Alrighty. By the way, I'm mocking this up and I'm using fill handles really quickly. Our next webinar for tips and tricks, I'll show you how to do some of these things to change your different fill handle, as well as our tips and tricks course goes into a lot of detail about those things. Okay, so now I've got my 2018 versus 2019 data in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new pivot table. So let me just select everything in here. I'm going to say insert pivot table. I'm going to put it into a new worksheet down here, so that's fine. And then click on OK. So to create a comparison for 2018 versus 2019, you do need to have the data in there, as I was mentioning, right? So I did mock up that data for you. When we first started out, we started out by grabbing the ID, throwing it into the rows, and we put in the amount of bonus dollars, throwing that into the values. That gives us the ID, so how many bonus dollars each person gets. And then to actually add on the information about the year, let me just make sure that this data stayed up to date here. It didn't stay up to date. Okay, just give me a second. Let's take a look. If ever your data is not up to date, right click. There's a refresh button there. Okay, now you can see it says year here instead of just date. So we're going to use that year information, put it into the columns, and now I've got my row labels for the ID, the individual ID, and the columns is here for the 2018 versus 2019 data. Tori, I do hope that helped you with your question there. All right, that pretty well ends all of the questions. Let me just pull up my slide again for getting a hold of us. If you do want any additional information about our courses, about our one-on-one training, anything like that, just reach out to us or send me a message in your group chat there, and just let me know, and I'll take some names down. But otherwise, you can also send us, and we'll contact you, by the way, if you do that. But otherwise, if you just want to send us an email as well, that's fine. So for Ottawa and the surrounding area, we do have training at computese.ca, or for JN Software, which is across Canada, info@jnsoftware.ca. We also respond to calls. We do like hearing people's voices, so certainly you can give us a quick call there as well. If you completely forget all of this information after we're done, which is fine, we are posting this webinar up online for you to view again, as well as we do have some on our websites, we do have some chat boxes, so you can definitely chat with our training coordinator that way, by just going to our website. Anywhere on our website, there will be some chat boxes there. So you can get a hold of us, please do. We do definitely like hearing from you, and we would definitely love to teach each and every one of you whatever we can. All right, I'm going to stay on for some extra questions. Just let me know if you do have some additional questions. I can pop back into my pivot tables and definitely help out. You're welcome. For those of you that are saying thank you, I really appreciate the thanks. Thanks for coming, everybody. Oh, and I did get the question answered about the attendance there. We don't have an official attendance certificate for this one here. Yeah, if there's some follow-up questions, just send us an email about that at training@computese or info@jnsoftware. To the question about how we will receive a copy of the recording, we will put it up on our website. So just keep an eye out on our website for the recording. I do believe as well, and I can just take a look and make sure that the recording will be made. There will be one of our newsletters sent out that will have the information on where to find it as well. So you can sign up for our newsletter as well, just to get a to get a notification that the recording is coming through. Oh, both CompuEase and JN will have our website, it up on their website. The video recording might be a little bit large to send through email. So we can send a notification out via the weekly newsletter. Oh, sorry, Helen, if you're still on there, we will be sending out a follow-up email to the participants as well. Sorry about that, Helen. That was some misinformation.